What would you do if you lived in a town of 1,000 people and discovered that one person had as much wealth as 900 other people in your little town? Today we're talking about inequality and the Poor People's Campaign on this episode of Rise Like Lions with Derek Rowe. Thanks for tuning in today, y'all. I just wanted to take a few minutes today to celebrate the revival of the Poor People's Campaign. For folks that don't know the background, 50 years ago this year, the Poor People's Campaign hit Washington, D.C. It was the last dream of Martin Luther King. He didn't live to see the campaign launch, but after his death, people took up the mantle, people like Jesse Jackson, and tried to drive a spike into the moral conscience of the nation on issues of inequality and racial injustice. And 50 years later, folks like Reverend Barber are taking this up and trying to continue that fight, to do a gut check for the nation 50 years later to see where we are, and to talk about what we can do about it, especially now that we're in the age of Trump. Now, the simple fact is that the U.S. right now is by far the most unequal society on the face of the earth as far as developed nations go. Since 1979, virtually all of the income gains have been captured by the top 1%. So essentially, my entire lifetime, I was born in 1980, the entire set of income gains that have happened in the United States since that time have all accrued to the top 1%, while the rest of us here in the bottom 99% have seen stagnated income growth and have watched through the rise of social media and other communications media the rise of this ultra-wealthy class that is now dominating our politics. Meanwhile, in the United States, 1 in 6 Americans goes hungry on a daily basis. And that's only if you are looking at food security. That doesn't count the other types of economic insecurity we're talking about here. Economic inequality is worse in this country than it was during the Great Depression. And if you look at what student loans are sitting at right now, they're between 6 and 8.5% on average, interest rates wise. And that's roughly what you pay on a crappy credit card. And we have $1.5 trillion of student debt in this country. So folks who are starting out in this country, having done the things that we tell them to do to get ahead and to live a better life than their parents lived, are finding themselves sinking into a debt hole in these jobs that don't pay enough to keep you above water. And that's especially true in rural areas. Some thinking from the administration caught my attention this week because John Kelly, the president's chief of staff, was in the news for saying that it's fine to separate these kids at the border because, you know, they're going to be put into foster care or whatever. And then he had this other tirade where he went on saying that these people who are coming to our country don't have skills and they're typically rural people who can't integrate into the United States. Now, I grew up in a small town, and one of the things that happens when you grow up in a small town is you get very tuned in to that exact kind of condescension from people who don't live in rural communities. And this idea that people who live in rural areas not having skills, well, A, in the United States, that would be a policy choice, but B, more generally, you know, people in rural areas face challenges that those of us who don't currently live in the rural areas anymore don't face anymore. We have better infrastructure, and that leads to easier times getting good schooling, and it leads to things like broadband access and all sorts of inequalities that accrue to the folks in the cities. And so when people talk about rural people with that kind of contempt, especially coming kind of shockingly from an administration that campaigned and aimed their rhetoric right at rural people and called them the forgotten people that are going to be forgotten no more, that's a little shocking and a little irritating, even when it comes to a president as loathsome as Trump. But what has been the administration's response to that? Well, you may not know about it right now because it's not one of the sexier issues that we deal with in Washington, but right now the Agriculture Committee is putting together its Farm Bill. And the Farm Bill is this comprehensive overarching piece of legislation that incorporates a lot of different pieces of incentives and regulations that deal with the agriculture sector, but it also deals with our hunger programs in the United States. And Trump and the Freedom Caucus are shoehorning in these work requirements into the SNAP program, which is the technical name for the food stamp program. And he's pushing this idea that the problem in the public benefits sector is that people aren't working as much as they could or they should. When one in four rural children, at the very least, even in our very draconian measures of poverty at the federal level, when 1 in 4 rural children lives in poverty, the president's response, as Dee Davis, who runs Rural Strategies, she said that the president's response is to withhold food. That the solution to poverty in rural areas is apparently to withhold food, or poverty generally is to withhold food, and to force people into these jobs. Now, that is not at all disconnected from what's going on with President Trump's disgusting border policies and his unjust immigration policies. And I promise this all relates to the Poor People's Campaign. I'll get there in just a second. The president right now is instituting these draconian immigration policies. He's separating families at the border, as we mentioned. And, he's pushing this canard that the people coming across the border are to blame for all the political and economic problems in this country. And they're the reason that you can't get a good paying job. And we got to shut down that kind of immigration coming in this country. And the simple fact of the matter is, when you look at what they're doing with this food stamp measure that they're trying to shoehorn into the Farm Bill, you can see that they're pushing an economy where, because these employers are now denied the labor that they had been using from immigrants and migrant workers that are essential to our economy in the food industry, in the meat packing industry, and all these other industries that rely on immigrant labor, they're looking at a worker shortage. And instead of pursuing a sane, humane immigration policy, the president and his food stamp work requirement policy is trying to press Americans into service who ought not to be working, who aren't working either from some kind of hardship or physical disability, or who can't work for any number of other reasons. And his idea is, instead of pushing companies to raise the minimum wage through a federal minimum wage hike, he is instead making it harder and harder and harder for people to get by without being shoved into one of these really crappy jobs that doesn't even pay them enough. And that will trap them further in these cycles of poverty, further in these cycles of debt, and you're going to see inequality going through the roof as Trump pursues policies like this in a time when we're already at record levels of inequality. So where has all that led us? Where are we 50 years after the first Poor People's Campaign? Well, in 2017, just 3 individuals possessed a combined wealth of about $250 billion. That's an amount of wealth in this country equal to the bottom 50% of the country. So 3 people in the United States have as much wealth combined as the entire bottom half in this country. And since the Poor People's Campaign was launched 50 years ago, U.S. social mobility has dropped by 70% in this country. In 2016, about half of 30-year-olds in this country earned less than their parents at the same age. And there are actually fewer voting rights in this country than at the end of Martin Luther King's life and at the start of the Poor People's Campaign. We talk about the civil rights era and the era where Martin Luther King and President Johnson were winning these concessions from the racist, segregationist Southerners in the terms of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act as this moment where we won. And I think if you talk to people who aren't experiencing the business end of systemic racism all day, and you just ask the typical suburban white person, do we have more rights in terms of civil rights and voting rights today versus in 1968? Most people would just say, yeah, we probably have more of those rights. And that's absolutely false. Because what's happened since the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act is that we've passed a raft of state-level racist voter identification laws. We have criminalized poverty and drug addiction at ever-escalating rates and put more people in prison, and because of that criminal background, they have fewer voting rights. We have done everything possible to make it impossible to vote. And when you look at that and look at the erosion of civil rights under the Bush administration, continuing under the Obama administration, the Trump administration, you can see that what we used to think were sacred rights, like the right to avoid self-incrimination and a rock-solid opposition to torture, and those two things are very closely combined, by the way, in the Fifth Amendment. You can see that our civil rights are eroding, and it's doubly true if you're in a community of color. And so in that interim, we've also become aware in the last 50 years of climate change and the climate crisis and the way in which environmental racism puts people who are typically poor and typically communities of color right in the crosshairs of a corporate enterprise that is destroying the planet and destroying those communities in the process. You'll have refineries situated right next to rural communities or poor communities or communities of color, and you'll have one set of people in our society reaping huge benefits from fossil fuels and dangerous environmental escapades like that. And then you'll have the people who have to live right next to it and work in those places shouldering all of the danger and all of the immediate effects. And then the rest of us who won't be able to move when the floods come will have to reap the longer term benefits of climate change. And we have done in those last 50 years virtually nothing to stop it. Only right now are solar and wind coming online. We have seen the fossil fuel industry systematically pursue a campaign of deception to try to muddy the waters on climate change action, to the point that now, as temperatures are beginning to skyrocket, we're looking at very expensive solutions as the only real ways out of it. I just saw a report out of the United Kingdom that a big fracking magnate has now become the richest person in that country. And it is not a coincidence that it always seems to be rich white guys pushing fracking as a bridge fuel 30 years after that could have been a possibility, because they see some short-term profits in it. And, you hear this cry all the time of where's the energy going to come from? But the real question we ought to be asking is, where are these people going to live? Because we are looking at sea level rise by the end of the century just on the milquetoast projections of the most middle-of-the-road projections and middle-of-the-road science on this, that says that in the Austin area where I live, we will be absorbing, by the end of the century, almost 1 million people fleeing from the coast. That's only one city. 140 million people, by some estimates, may have to leave coastal areas in the United States alone, thanks to climate change. By 2100, a third of the Earth's surface may be desert conditions, and 1.5 billion people live in those places that will be deserts by 2100. Now, those are very middle-of-the-road projections. Dr. James Hansen and Professor Ingrafia have all outlined much worse, much more scary scenarios. You may recognize Ingrafia's name as the guy who first revealed the actual cost of fracking and the actual environmental risk that puts it up there, in some estimates, as bad as coal in terms of both the leakages from methane and the impact that has on climate change, but also in the way that natural gas and fracking infrastructure has crowded out investments from things like wind and solar, such that we may hit a 2-degree temperature rise not in 20 or 30 years, but in the next 5 to 10 years. Now that's a crisis, and there are people looking at the impacts of that migration that will trigger away from affected areas. And they have said that climate change is about to trigger the largest transfer of money from poor people to rich people via that real estate migration, bigger than anything else that's ever happened in this country. Climate change, mark my words, will become one of the biggest drivers of inequality in the next 50 years. And folks that are treating this like any other issue are condemning folks to abject poverty and environmental devastation, and it will be the poor people who have to fight that battle on the front lines every single day. And so I was really proud today to go down to the state capitol and join the Austin, I don't know what you would call it, the Austin cadre of the Poor People's Campaign, as they got together in front of the state capitol. And you can see some pictures on my Instagram page at Elect Crow of that gathering. There are right now all over the country groups of people coming together in the Poor People's Campaign revival in coordinated actions that'll take place over the next 40 days. There'll be nonviolent disruptions all over the country. The campaign is committed to nonviolence, but we're also committed to shaking things up, because we believe, as the sign says behind me, that the war on the poor is immoral. And the people that are going to be involved in this campaign believe that we need a new disruptive force, nationwide to put poor people back on the agenda. And in the age of Trump, nothing could be more urgent. As we go into these midterms, I ran for Congress on a platform of making a country that works for everybody, not just corporations and the rich. And as we enter into these midterm elections, it is absolutely essential that we put poor people and the working class at the front and center of the agenda. Because when you come down to it, what's happening right now is Trump is uniting a certain cadre of very poor, disenfranchised people with bigotry and racism and with corporatism. And if you look at what he's doing both in Syria and around the world and with the Iran deal that he's thrown away, you can see echoes, very direct references to the giant triplets that Martin Luther King talked about. I thought about his words. I think about them often, but I thought about his words while we were standing there at the Capitol when he said, when machines and profit motives and property rights are more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, militarism, and extreme materialism are incapable of being conquered. And he's absolutely right. And in this country, in the last election cycle, we basically elected those three triplets to run this country. So the need for this relaunch of the Poor People's Campaign could not be more urgent, and it couldn't be more timely. So I'm going to take a second here just to read you the demands that the Poor People's Campaign is making and invite you to join us and the others around the country, wherever you are at the Poor People's Campaign, to put this back on the agenda and get, not only in the midterms in politics, but in our everyday life, poor people in the working class back on the national agenda. Because if we don't do that, President Trump will be able to drive racist and other kinds of identity wedges, things. We'll put social issues front and center that divide us into pieces instead of fighting for a unified country that works for everybody. That, if we don't address these economic issues, he'll be able to split us into pieces and set us against each other, and our country won't be able to unite behind an agenda that can counter the bold vision that they're putting forward. So here are the demands they're making. They're saying, we declare that if silence was betrayal in 1968, revival is necessary today. We come to remind our nation what truths we hold to be self-evident and what values we hold dear. We draw on the histories of resistance that echo their truth down through the centuries and the power of the blood that has been shed through generations of struggle. And we loudly proclaim that we will move forward together and not one step back. And they are putting things like economic inequality, climate change action, systemic racism, civil rights, voting rights back front and center in their Poor People's Campaign. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to join them. So you can go to poorpeoplescampaign.com and learn more. I would urge you to do that and become a part of this. And like I said, President Trump is going to try to use wedge issues to pull us apart at the seams all over this country and then try to scapegoat all of our problems on immigrants and people of color. And what we've got to do in response is to not only say no to that racism and that bigotry, but also counter with an agenda that puts everybody back to work through things like a federal jobs guarantee that addresses climate change injustices through a real clean energy agenda that gets us off fossil fuels and gets our emissions down to net zero by 2035, that puts our wages back up to a workable level at $15 an hour or more and then indexes them to inflation, that gives us college for all, health care for all, Medicare for all, and starts undoing some of these deep existential injustices that are creating these crises for different communities all over our country that are life-threatening. Not everybody's Steve Mnuchin, not everybody's Donald Trump, not everybody's the 1%. We have to have a country that works for everybody, not just corporations and the rich. So I thank y'all for tuning in a little bit today. I hope that you'll join into the Poor People's Campaign wherever you are across the country. And I hope you'll keep fighting that fight for a country that works for everybody and not just the 1% and the corporations. So again, poorpeoplescampaign.com is where you can tune in. I would also urge you to become a patron for this content. You can go to patreon.com/Derrick Crowe. That's DERRICKCROWE. You can see it on the crawl below me on the screen here. I'm going to be making this content regularly. There's going to be a lot of content, more than half of it actually, that'll be sponsor only. So you'll have to sign sign up for either just $1 a month or more to get access to that content, but that's going to allow me to do things like buy social media paid placements to push this content. So if this is a message you feel like needs to be out there, please become a patron at patreon.com/Derek Crow. So thanks for tuning in again. Thanks for tuning in to our new show, Rise Like Lions, and we will see you out there on the front lines. Take care.